me start with a few quick thanks, but very deep thanks to the participants in today's event. First Deputy Minister Simon Papian, it's our pleasure to have you with us today. Dear Ms. Derboyan and Mr. Grigorian, Dr. Grigorian, thank you for agreeing to spend your holiday here with us. And Ms. Adriana Jordanova, flying all the way from Washington, D.C. for a number of meetings this morning, and then after that coming here. It's admirable the energy you put into this, and thank you for contributing to our national discussion on environmental impact assessments. It is my hope that AUA can become a space to discuss environmental issues openly and rigorously. For this, we need government, business, international organizations, and civil society to come together and exchange ideas and views. This will only strengthen our ability as a country to develop sound approaches and policies to issues of critical importance to current and future generations. While in most public arenas, many of these stakeholders hurl insults and accusations at each other, sometimes gently and sometimes not, a university is not a place where we should do this. We should keep the spirit of open and free inquiry alive, at least within these walls. In the remaining few minutes, I would like to go over a few key concepts that will be discussed over and over again throughout the discussions today. The topic may be a little bit esoteric for those who are not familiar with it, so please bear with me. I think this will be worth the few minutes that I'll spend explaining the key concepts. First and foremost is the environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessment is a systematic process of identifying, predicting, and evaluating the environmental effects of proposed projects. And I'm highlighting project today because it is very much a project-focused process. Okay? It is a systematic assessment that is used as a decision-making tool. It is not a decision, it's a decision-making tool. Okay? And more and more public health and economic well-being factors are involved in EIAs, environmental impact assessments. The other concept that is going to be key in understanding when people talk about, our presenters will talk about it, is EIAs within a transboundary context. This is EIAs for projects that will have impact across borders. Okay. So if we build a nuclear power plant, that clearly interests our neighbors. So there will be an EIA within a transboundary context. Okay. And a lot of these are as I'll mention quickly, especially the transboundary context is based on Armenia's international obligations vis-a-vis the ESPO measure. Then there's the idea of strategic environmental assessment. Strategic environmental assessment is different from an EIA in that it is not project-focused, but it is policy or program-focused. So if the Armenian government announces that over the next 10 years, mining is going to be a key economic development engine, it's a policy statement that would be subject to a strategic environmental assessment. Likewise, I guess, if you announce that hydropower is the major energy policy direction for the next 5 years, then that policy would be subject to a strategic environmental assessment. The final concept that I want to present is something called cumulative impact assessment. It is assessment for projects that, or it's a type of assessment that doesn't necessarily look at individual projects, but it looks at the impact of those projects if there are many of them done over time. So if we build one small hydropower plant on a river, that may not have a huge impact. But if we build 15 of them, there's a cumulative impact that those projects will have. And the idea of cumulative impact assessment is supposed to capture that impact of cumulative impact of projects. The first three concepts are based on Armenia's international obligations. Some of these agreements, directly and some indirectly, ask for Armenia or compel Armenia to develop legislation that incorporates these concepts in the national legislation. ESPU, Orhus, the C or Kiev Protocol, and to some extent the Convention on Biological Diversity are the basis for a lot of what is happening today with our draft law on environmental impact assessment. This cumulative impact assessment is not based on, as far as I know, it's not based on any legislative instruments, any international legal instruments. It is a best practice that IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and others are talking about, and I think it's worth thinking about how to incorporate that into national legislation. And as far as I recall, in the current draft of the national legislation, there is no talk of cumulative impact assessment. Again, environmental impact assessment is a process, and it has many steps. It is not a decision. What I'm trying to do here to give you a sense of what the process looks like. This process is a generalized picture of an environmental impact assessment process that UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, has developed for educational purposes. While it looks complex, there are a few key steps that could be generalized from this. The first one is screening of projects. What projects are subject to an EIA? I think we will all agree that if I want to change the windows in my apartment, it would be unrealistic to expect that I should go through an EIA evaluation process. But if the country wants to build a nuclear power plant, clearly we think that an EIA should be done. So this step of screening is when projects are determined whether they should do an EIA or not. A lot of this will be defined in the legislation that's being drafted now. So that's a point that we need to be careful and pay a lot of attention to. The second step is basically scoping the work. What is it that the EIA will do? A lot of this will be defined by legislation, but some of it may be discretionary, and we'll see how the law addresses this question of what is the scope of work for the EIA, for projects that have to do an EIA. The third step then would be actually doing the EIA itself. By the way, I should mention that in scoping of the work, generally, UNEP says that that's the stage where there is public participation, okay, in scoping the work. Now, please keep in mind these are only suggestions. You might want to consider that public participation happens earlier, or it doesn't happen there. It's all discretionary up to how we draft the legislation in the country. Okay? After we do the EIA, and in fact in that EIA process itself, the impact analysis, understanding the mitigation measures, understanding how to manage the risks, EIA needs to capture all of those. And when we do those, there may also be a role for public participation. So while it's not mentioned here, this is just a schematic. So we can decide what to incorporate at what stage. After the assessment is done, a report is produced and it is reviewed. And this is also often where public participates. And after the review, the authorities, whoever is authorized to approve or disapprove, makes a decision. And once the decision is made to approve the project, then the project goes into implementation. If it's rejected, it doesn't mean the project doesn't happen. It may go back and redesign, ask for redesign, and then resubmit it again. So taking into consideration the environmental impact assessment recommendations or concerns. And if projects are approved implementation, then it gets implemented, and hopefully we also would have a system where we would have a feedback into the original screening system, so there is a learning process throughout the EIA. Let me finish by a few caveats. It is a tendency to expect too much from each piece of legislation. An environmental impact assessment is a decision-making tool. They're not the final solution. These concepts that we talked about are not the final solutions to our environmental concerns or woes. If we fail to see this, we will unjustifiably, in my opinion, be disappointed. They will not result in advancing a particular environmental norm. So no economic activity in forests, that's not the kind of thing an EIA would say yes or no. No mining in the country, that's not the kind of thing EIA would say yes or no. And in fact, I think this is captured, this whole idea is captured very astutely and very eloquently by the US Supreme Court when they reviewed the EIA laws of the United States, which incidentally is the first country that implemented EIAs. That was the first policy innovation in the late 60s, early 70s. And the Supreme Court said that the law, the EIA legislation, let me just get closer to read, merely prohibits uninformed rather than unwise decisions, actions. There is also the concern that you need local capacity to do good quality assessment. And that's the capacity we need to develop in the country. We may not have it at the present, or we may have it in sporadically. Okay? So even if we have a great piece of legislation, it doesn't mean we do good environmental impact assessments. We will need to develop capacity in the country. There is also a risk of proceduralism. This is like agencies are very comfortable with ticking boxes. We did this, we did this, we did this, and not get deep into the environmental concerns that an EIA is supposed to address. And the US courts have also dealt with this because this is not only an Armenian phenomenon, worldwide, bureaucracies tend to simplify actions into checkboxes. And so the US courts have put have used an interesting doctrine of hard look doctrine, namely that the final decision makers have to consider every aspect of the decision or the comments before they make their final decision. So simply because that assessment was done, a biodiversity assessment was done, that's not sufficient. You need to deeply look at what was said throughout or from opposing views and all views, what was said about the impact, on biodiversity, for instance. The issue is that public participation also often has an impact on decisions. But we have to be careful about making public participation almost like a referendum on decisions. Because it will only be one factor in the final decision making. But it has to be, I think the law has to mandate that the public comments are fully integrated in the final decision. Not as a vote, yes or no, but as a substantive comment to the final decision that's being made. Finally, I'll wrap it up quickly. Monitoring and compliance remains a concern even if we have the best EIA law on the books. And as a very comprehensive report on the impact, evaluation of the impact of EIAs has done back in mid-1990s, is that we have to be able to move from environmental assessment to sustainable sustainability and sustainability assurance. And going from assessment to assurance is what we also need to work through our, what I call the environmental governance regime. Okay, with that, please, I invite the speakers to come up to the stage and Papian, Mr. Papian, get the girl personal, Adriana, please come, Arthur, William.